Hello, everyone, and welcome to League of Women Voters Presents. Tonight, we're talking about the lawsuit on school funding. School funding has been a big issue in our area. There are a lot of people who are not happy with paying the property tax to fund our schools. They find it very expensive. And this lawsuit challenges the way the legislature has been doing it, funding education here for years. So we have several exciting guests with us tonight. We have Susan Spica, who is with Education Voters of PA, and she's going to give us a bunch of background. And then we have two legal experts here. Deborah Gordon-Clare, who is with the Education Law Center. She's their executive director. And Mimi McKenzie, who is with the Public Interest Law Center. And they are two firms that are, or two agencies that are instrumental in this lawsuit we're talking about that says the legislature is not doing its job. So, Susan, would you start us off with some background on what we're talking about here?
Yep, and thank you for inviting us, and just, huge thanks to the League for your very, very long-standing support of fixing this school funding system in Pennsylvania to make sure that all students have what they need. The League has just been extraordinary with your chapters throughout the state. So in the Constitution, the Constitution says, the Pennsylvania Constitution says that the General Assembly shall provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of public education to serve the needs of the Commonwealth. And in Pennsylvania, our state legislature is incredibly cheap when it comes to funding our schools. So we rank 45th in the nation. So we've got like 45 guy behind me. We rank 45th in the nation in the state share of K-12 funding. And so when the state share is that low, it means that there is just a super heavy reliance on property taxes to fund schools. So what we see is that there are some communities that can fund their schools. They have enough property wealth that they can raise their taxes, and what the state doesn't pay, they can make up for locally, relatively easily. But then we have other communities. So we're thinking about like big cities, areas that are shrinking, rural areas where there's just nothing to tax. They just cannot generate enough school funding at the local level to be able to fund their schools. These school districts also tend to be school districts that educate students who tend to be poor, and also many students of color live in these very low wealth districts. So what we're finding is that students are very likely to live in poverty, or there are a lot of English language learners who are in the lowest wealth districts. And so we have this gross disparity in the amount of funding that wealthy districts are able to generate and able to spend on students versus our poorest districts. So Deborah and Mimi will go into that more later, but just in general, an expert report was prepared, and it found that we are using an actual benchmarks that are in state law that look at what would it cost to educate students so that they can meet the state standards that the legislature has set, so the PSSA test and the Keystone test that students have to take every year. We are $4.6 billion short in Pennsylvania in terms of funding our schools, and it's 86% of students attend a school that is not adequately funded, and 277 of the state school districts are underfunded by more than $2,000. So it's, what we see are the students who have the greatest needs. They are the ones that are in the buildings that have the fewest resources available to serve their needs. And so it's a really terrible system. We were in Harrisburg today because we heard testimony recently that there was a school in Panther Valley where there were 75 kindergartners sharing a single toilet. And then later, after we planned our rally, the superintendent in Johnstown said that there were 125 first grade and kindergarten students sharing a single bathroom that had a single toilet and a single sink. And her testimony was heart-wrenching, talking about kids waiting in line. It took too long. They had accidents. The amount of disruption in the day, it was just, and these are just like the learning conditions that students are in, because we have a state legislature that absolutely has refused to, live up to its constitutional obligation to fund our schools. So I'm going to turn it over to our legal experts to kind of talk more about the case and more about what's happening with the lawsuit right now.
Okay, well, I turn to Deborah and Mimi, and they have some slides, I think, to show us as well. There we go.
And Deborah, do you want to kick us off, and then I'll pick up about partway through?
Sure. And I just want to confirm that you're seeing the one big screen, right?
Correct.
Okay, great.
I love it when it all works.
Yeah, I know, which is half the time. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And I actually haven't even been upstairs yet. I'm just home from a couple days in the courtroom, and we're really pleased to be able to share this information with you. So just by a little bit of background, there we go. And thank you, Susan, for sharing this information. That, part of the problem is that we have the legislature, which has that constitutional obligation, as Susan referenced. We're stuck in a situation where they did not set for themselves, the legislature or legislative leaders, a goal of fully funding schools. And so they don't. And so even though they do know, they could figure out what each district needs, that hasn't been the goal that they've set. And so there's a relatively low state contribution. I too have the 45 guy behind me. Like Susan, Pennsylvania really ranks quite low in terms of the state share, meaning that the local school districts were overly reliant on local school districts, and even districts we'll talk about like Reading that tax themselves at high levels, high tax effort, have low tax capacity. So they just have to keep taxing, and it's still not generating the dollars those schools need. So low relative state contribution, high relative local contribution. And we do have a fair funding formula that takes into account the needs of school districts and the needs of students, but the state is not adequately adding new money into that formula. And so we're left with a situation where low wealth communities need the most, try the hardest with high tax effort, but they don't have what they need. And so I'm gonna just plunk these on. We are in a situation where you could compare two school districts, Reading School District and New Hope Solebury. One is a relatively wealthy school district, New Hope Solebury. They are not taxing themselves at a particularly high rate, but that tax rate does generate over $25,000 per student. And so the state does give them some funding, and total overall, they have $30,000, over $30,000 per student. Multiply that by a class of 30, multiply that by a school. It is a well-funded school district. And then
Deborah, if I can just come in here, I know I'm in a suburb of Reading, and my taxes on my home are much lower than the taxes on a similar, there is no similar home perhaps in the city of Reading, but per square foot, they're paying about 6 times what I'm paying in the suburbs. So that's a very real number based on, real people, that per square foot, their rates are that much higher.
That's right.
It's a huge difference.
It's a huge difference. And we see that in the numbers in Reading, where it's a very high tax rate. That's what you're talking about. It's a high tax rate, but because the property values are relatively low, it's not able to generate very much money locally. Even with that very high rate, it's only generating a little over $2,500 per student. The state does provide a bit more than what it does in New Hope, but still not nearly enough to close the gap of what this school district needs to meet the needs of its student. And so total, we're looking at just over 13,000 compared to New Hope Solebury, over 30,000. Reading School District does not receive the funding it needs to adequately serve the students in the district. It's over almost $17,000 difference per child. And then remember what that means multiplied across an entire class, a school, a district.
And we also noted with the census that the Reading population is up, and the number of you're coming up with the English language learners, that number is probably higher than the percent you have on the screen at this point. just based on the figures with the new census.
You're right. And so this slide is a little bit old now, and I'm sure that you're right that these numbers have even increased, but we're looking at two districts. You look at Reading and you know this is your community. There's a very high number of students in poverty and very high number of English learners. In fact, the highest number of English learners in the state. And so what we know this means is it does cost more to adequately provide services to students in deep poverty, concentrated poverty, English learners, et cetera. And so here we have a district that needs more funding than a relatively wealthier district with a low number of students in poverty and a low number of English learners. And yet what you saw on the previous slide is this district does not have the dollars it needs, and it has students, it has costs in the districts that it cannot meet. And so this is true across, I mean, I showed you two school districts, but this is true across the state where there is a $4,800 gap per student between our wealthiest and poorest school districts. It's an equity problem and it's an adequacy issue. It's both that our poorest school districts simply don't have what they need and we're not spending enough overall. We can't redistribute a teeny tiny pie. We really need to grow the pie and distribute it in a fairer way.
And I've lobbied the legislature many, many times on school funding, and they always say, we can't get everybody to agree. And it seems like a lame excuse at this point because I've been lobbying here for close to 40 years. And it's always the same thing that in that time period, they should have been able to agree on some way to make this work better.
We believe that they're in violation of their constitutional obligation to adequately and equitably fund schools. And we'll get in just 2 minutes into what we're doing about it in the judicial system. But one couple of more slides to just say, we know this and you know this if you've ever been in a school, money matters. And in fact, when we invest in education, we know that it makes a difference. It makes a difference on college attendance, graduation rates, and that even holding constant a child who's a low-income student, if that student attends school in a well-funded district, their college attendance and graduation rates are higher than if they attend school in a low-funded district. And opportunity gaps abound. We also know that in Pennsylvania, our lowest funded districts disproportionately serve students of color, Black students, Latinx students, and this only exacerbates what we're not providing to our students. So we have multiple studies show that Pennsylvania has large gaps in outcome by race and economic background, and that is because we are underfunding school districts. So what are we doing about it, Mimi?
Okay, well, we filed our lawsuit in November of 2014. Yes, that's right, November of 2014. This case is filed in the Commonwealth Court, and the case was dismissed by the Commonwealth Court. We went up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court found that these issues were justiciable, which means they are in fact issues that the court can decide. And so we were then sent back to Commonwealth Court, where for years we engaged in discovery, where each side found out about the other side's claims. And eventually we are here. We are actually on trial. We are super excited about it. Just to reiterate, there are actually 2 constitutional violations that we are asserting in this case. The first is a violation of the education clause itself, that they are not providing a thorough and efficient system of education. And then the second claim is a violation of the equal protection provisions in the Pennsylvania Constitution because the legislature is discriminating against students in low wealth districts.
Could we for a minute just talk about, because we were talking about Reading, and I don't want our viewers to think that this is strictly an urban problem, but you have, I think, 6 different school districts. Oh,
There we
here they are.
go.
There we go. So Lancaster and the Panther Valley, that's Schuylkill County, which is just to our north, and that was a coal mining area. And they're no longer mining coal. So it's a more rural area and one that just the productivity, the jobs are no longer there. So it's not just cities. We're talking about all across the state.
Absolutely. So this is a problem in rural districts. It's a problem in suburban districts. It's a problem in urban districts. And you see that sort of representation just in the named petitioners in this lawsuit. In addition, we also have parents and students from a couple of school districts, including Philadelphia. And we have two organizational plaintiffs. We have the NAACP Pennsylvania State Conference, which covers the entire Commonwealth. And we also have the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools, which has, I think, close to about 180 to 200 members. Member school districts across the Commonwealth. So you're absolutely right, Judith. It's really a representative group of petitioners. And so who's responsible for this? Well, the named respondents or defendants in this lawsuit are the folks in charge of the funding system. So we have, and of course they're sued in their official capacities, not their personal capacities, but we have the governor, we have the legislative leaders, the president pro tem of the Senate, Corman, the Speaker of the House, Cutler, we have the Secretary of Education, we have the Department of Education, and the Board of Education, because they are the organizations and entities that are responsible for this inadequate and inequitable system that is been in place. So what are we asking the court to do? We get this question a lot because in reality, the court is not going to tell the legislature, oh, okay, you need to write a check for this amount of money for the districts. What the court in all likelihood will do, and what we are asking them to do, is to declare that the current system of funding is unconstitutional, and then to put in place a funding scheme that will adequately fund students' education across the Commonwealth so that they're able to meet the state academic standards. Now, obviously, there's a lot of perhaps latitude, or it sounds like there's a lot of latitude in that. The court, should we prevail, will certainly give guidance to the legislature about what the elements of that system need to be. But it will go back to the legislature. And, you know, the legislature, I think, has a choice. They have multiple choices, right? They could actually fix it right now, right? They could fix it right now and we could all go home.
They could have fixed it any time in the last 40 years if they had really wanted to do the work, yes.
Exactly. But should they be ordered to fix it, you know, again, I think there's, they can do that in a way that's, you know, efficient and effective and happens pretty quickly. Or, you know, potentially, I guess they could drag it out. And so I think later in our program, Susan in particular is going to talk about the role that all of us can play as citizens and residents and voters in
as property
persuading
taxpayers. Yeah, property taxpayers. Yeah.
Well, and even folks who maybe aren't paying property tax, but concerned citizens.
Oh yeah.
As voters, we all have a role to play in this. So Deborah and I are going to talk for a few minutes, and then, you know, we can also, Judith, answer questions about what is happening in court right now. So
before we go into court, I just wanted to review for our viewers who don't keep up on court things what the Commonwealth Court is. They're familiar with district magistrates because that's where they go to play traffic fines and landlord-tenant issues and things. And they know our Common Pleas Court, because that's where the murder cases happen and the more civil complaints happen. But then there are two courts above that that are usually appeals courts. One is Superior, where appeals go from the Common Pleas Court, and one is Commonwealth, where things go if they relate to something the Commonwealth, as the state of Pennsylvania, has done. But usually those are appeals, and this is not an appeal. So could you explain that part for us?
Sure. So, Judith, you're absolutely right. The Commonwealth Court is a court of special jurisdiction in some respects, in that it deals with issues involving the Commonwealth or involving agencies of the Commonwealth. And when you're bringing an action against the Commonwealth itself for one of their agencies, you actually typically bring those claims in Commonwealth Court as a court of original jurisdiction. So sometimes they hear appeals from the Court of Common Pleas. In fact, a lot of times they do, but they also can be a trial court or a court of original jurisdiction when parties like we are here in the school funding lawsuit are bringing claims against Commonwealth entities. So it's a little unusual for them to have a trial of this magnitude. You know, it happens from time to time. In fact, a few years ago, I had the pleasure of being in Commonwealth Court representing the League of Women Voters, among others, when we challenged redistricting. We were in Commonwealth Court and had a trial in Commonwealth Court. So it happens from time to time, but this trial is a marathon. I think we're looking at, you know, an 8 to 10 week trial, and we are in week 4, but who's counting?
And one more question on the court setup. If there's an appeal from this Commonwealth Court acting as a trial court, does that then go to a panel of the Commonwealth Court, or does it go right to the Supreme Court?
So once there's been a judge, a Commonwealth Court judge assigned to be the trial court judge in this case, and ultimately she will make findings of fact and conclusions of law, and she will render a decision, an opinion. And then either party has a direct appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. You might be familiar that sometimes the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has to be petitioned and they don't necessarily have to hear an appeal. But in this particular situation where your first court, if you will, your trial court is Commonwealth Court, you have an automatic right of appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So there is, you know, a pretty good chance, no matter what happens in Commonwealth Court, that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court will ultimately make the final decision in this case.
Thank you, because I wasn't clear on that, how that worked.
Sure.
We thought maybe it would be helpful to pause from the PowerPoint and just Mimi and I have spent a lot of time in court, and also it's being live streamed. If you go to www.fundourschoolspa.org/trial, you too can watch from the comfort of your own home every single day, except not tomorrow, there's no court tomorrow. But besides that, every single day you can live stream trial, which I guess is a silver lining of COVID protocols. So you can see in court the witnesses testifying and the lawyers asking questions and the judge, et cetera. And it's been, you know, so far just a couple of weeks in, we've heard from school district petitioners and expert witnesses and witnesses from the Department of Education and the State Board of Education. You heard Susan Spica when she opened talk about some of the, I think, examples that have really stuck in our heads, especially those of us who have young children, what that must mean to have one toilet for 125 first graders or one toilet for 75 young children as well. And And I think, other examples that the school district petitioners have shared, and again, rural, urban, suburban, all over, really paint the picture of districts that have to make unimaginable choices because they simply don't have the funding. So one example that sticks in my mind, we heard from Greater Johnstown, where there are 1,200 students in the elementary school, and many children come to kindergarten not knowing how to read, not knowing how to hold a book, not recognizing letters and sounds, et cetera. And for that district, that elementary school with 1,200 students, they can only afford 2 reading specialists. And not only that, but the building is such that the children are pulled out and then taught in a cinder block closet. No ventilation, no windows. Some students are taught there. They use a locker room as a classroom. This is not where we would want any of our children to have to go to school. And these are the choices that superintendents and teachers and principals have to make because they simply don't have the funding that they need. So that's one example that is really, really sticking out in my mind, Mimi.
One that I remember, and if we're done, are we done with slides? We should.
We have a couple more, but if you want us to finish the slides and then take it off and
yeah, so we don't have it, so we can see whole faces. That'd be nice.
Sure. Well, all right, Mimi, back to you.
Sure. So just a few last points. We keep, I think up front, Deborah gave an excellent example of the equity gap between New Hope, Solebury, and Reading. And of course, we also know that there is this adequacy gap. And there actually is a state law that requires that the Commonwealth basically calculate, how much funding do you need to provide this adequate education? And years back, the Commonwealth took a shot at that, I think, quickly realized how underfunded districts are and has not really been calculating this adequacy target for a few years now. But in the lawsuit, there is an expert, Professor Matt Kelly, who is an expert on school funding. He's from Penn State. And he's actually taken that calculation that comes out of a state law that's no longer being followed and, figured out, okay, using just the state's own number, how underfunded are we? And if you total it all up across the 500 school districts, we're looking at $4.6 billion underfunded a year. That's dramatic. He also broke that down for each of the petitioner districts. And in fact, you can go to Fund Our Schools PA, go to your school district on the map and see how underfunded your particular school district is. And so, for example, we can see that the school district of Reading is dramatically underfunded by, over $8,500 per student. So these are significant gaps, to say the least. And so, if we are successful, what could we expect in Pennsylvania down the road? And there have been other states that have successfully brought school funding lawsuits, and what you see is that when a state, when there's a successful school funding lawsuit, ultimately the state ends up having more revenue for funding than it otherwise would have raised. And that increased funding translates into improved academic outcomes. One of the things I think that it can be particularly helpful. I think, as Judith pointed out, for this problem could have been fixed for 40 years, but there doesn't seem to be enough political will to fix it. And a lawsuit with a court ruling in favor of the petitioner school districts could really break that political impasse that we have right now in Pennsylvania. And so that's the, that's the ultimate hope.
Mhm. And I know several of our local state representatives are very much against the property tax. And I think they see this as a way to at least help decrease reliance on that property tax, which would be very appealing, I would think, to most Berks County voters who tend to be opposed to the property tax as the main school funding. I think the league's position may not be that, and I should remind our viewers that none of what we're saying here is necessarily the opinion of the league, unless I've said it is, or of BCTV. The league does support this lawsuit. We have always supported equal access to education for every student, that every student should have the same basic capabilities and opportunities in their education. And when the state does pass legislative mandates, and they do that all the time, they should come with the resources to fulfill them. I had lived once in North Carolina, which is an interesting comparison because it was during the Great Depression in the early 1930s that they did not want their schools, their local schools, to fail. So they managed to pull the state funding together and exclusively fund their schools off state tax dollars. And when I lived there in the 1970s, that was still the fact. They did have local school boards to decide things at the local level, but the funding was entirely from the state. I'm sure that local communities pitched in and had the usual bake sales and things like that to fund field trips and other things. But those basic educational mandates given by the state were met by the state coffers. And it just therefore surprised me very much moving here how different it was here. So let's talk more about the testimony. The testimony that I think moved me was the concept of split classes. And I think that's happening
Triple split,
everywhere.
right?
Yeah, triple split sometimes. That we don't have enough substitutes. We all know we have shortages right now because of the pandemic. So there aren't the substitutes. So if nobody's there to take a class, the class is split between several teachers. So if your normal class size would be the ideal 24, now you've got 36, 38, sometimes 50, sometimes 60 elementary aged children. It's mind-boggling. It's encouraging teacher burnout.
Yeah, I do think though that these problems even predated the pandemic. Because especially in, I think, we're starting to hear in testimony from some of the poor rural communities that they don't have the funding to offer a competitive teacher salary compared to their surrounding districts. So even before we had perhaps the problem of like not having enough substitute teachers, I think a lot of districts in Pennsylvania, the low wealth districts, have vacancies for long stretches of time. And that has implications for student learning. They're not necessarily able to hire and retain the most qualified. They certainly have teachers who are trying their hardest, absolutely, but maybe don't have as many of the experienced teachers to help guide and develop newer teachers. So and then there's just the simple fact of the matter, like we heard, for example, from Shenandoah, a very small school district, and they have, like Reading, an increasing number of English language learners. They also have a very high special ed population. And so a certain number of their teachers absolutely have to be English language teachers and special ed teachers. And so it starts to reduce then the number of teachers you have available for all of these electives that we would all love children to be able to take. And so that's also driving, it's not just the lack of substitutes, but the lack of funding is driving some of these wacky classroom configurations you're hearing about.
So we've heard from the school districts Have we heard from parents yet or on what they've said?
Still to come, as well as other school districts. We've heard from Shenandoah Valley, Panther Valley, and Greater Johnstown, but we will be hearing from other school districts like Lancaster and our other petitioners in the coming weeks. And I think all of the testimony really does illustrate the inadequate and inequitable funding faced by our school districts, our parents, our teachers, et cetera. And then in addition to hearing directly from those in the school districts, we're also hearing from experts. Mimi referenced Professor Matt Kelly.
Yeah.
We have a lot of Matts. Professor Matt Kelly, who did the calculation, just updated the state's own calculations to get to that $4.6 billion adequacy gap number. We've had other experts, we have this education clause in the state constitution, and we had a law professor who's an expert on state constitutions and has spent a lot of time looking at what did the Constitutional Convention, what were the drafters thinking, and looking at, hundreds and hundreds of pages, thousands of pages that went over sort of documented what went into the creation of the education clause and what did they mean and what was their intent. I think that was important to.
Yeah, I did print off some of his remarks because I thought they were so phenomenal. First of all, we should note for our viewers that the Constitution in Pennsylvania has been changed several times over the years, but this particular clause dates from the 1870s. And they wanted to ensure that Pennsylvania citizens were engaged, intelligent voters, which is the key to a functional government. And doesn't that speak to the current time we're in when we have these, voting issues? And they believed the best way to accomplish this was a high quality school system for all students. And they actually did at that time period mean all. Even though women couldn't vote yet, women were included as needing this education from, what I've gathered here. There was, prior to that, there was a pauper school system then, and this clause abolished it. So they wanted a new system that would serve every child in the state, which is, again, where we're saying they wanted it to serve everybody in the same way. And according to the constitutional scholar, they thought that it was really important if you kept kids in different schools or different classifications of schools, when it came down to it, inevitably the poor kids would get an inferior education. And so back in the 1870s, they were clearly aware that that was an issue. And they wanted to avoid oppressive taxation on some communities to fund schools. So that's another point. So he's found, I'm guessing he's found all that information in all the documentation of that constitutional conventional meeting from the 1870s. And isn't it nice we have historians to dig those things up? It was really fascinating to see what he'd written and how much that speaks to today. So was there anything else? Susan, did you get to hear his testimony? Was there anything else you picked up from it?
Yeah, so I would just want to put in a real plug to anybody who's watching this right now to go to www.fundourschoolspa.org. And for a couple of reasons. So first, there will be a little box that will sign up and you can put your email in it, and then you can yourself get updates directly from the law centers about what is happening in court. So if you don't have time to tune in, you can learn what's happening each day. I love the recaps. If you are at home and you have time to tune in, especially when we have school leaders like you would even be surprised by how riveting it can be to listen to a school business official. The school business official who was at Johnstown he came in at a time when the school district was facing enormous challenges. And as the person who had to look at how to keep the school district financially viable, he had to make recommendations for different really, really, really terrible things like closing buildings, cutting programs. And one of the attorneys asked him, he said, what was your nickname? And he said, the Grim Reaper, because he had to go in and just, you know, really gut a lot of what really made school for kids. And so, you know, I've traveled around the state and done forums with superintendents. And I will tell you, it was very unusual to get through a forum with superintendents in rural Pennsylvania without having someone choke up in the middle and like break down, because the decisions and the weight of the decisions that is resting on the shoulders of the people leading our school districts and our very underfunded school districts is extraordinary. And so these individuals go on the stand and they are giving facts and figures, but they are also like pouring their hearts out about what it is that they have to do to be able to keep these schools open. Because if they don't make decisions to cut teachers and to close buildings and to eliminate programs, it's going to mean that their school district is going to go belly up. And that is not they can't do that. They have to balance the budget at the end of every year. So I really encourage people to go to fundourschoolspa.org. There's right at the top, there's a link and it just says click here to watch, and you can just click and you can watch. This is a moment when, you know, state lawmakers constantly say, oh, it's fine. We increased funding. They pass a budget every year that has some minimal increase in funding so that they can go back to their school districts and they can say, we gave you more money than last year. And then they pat themselves on the back. They like dislocate their shoulders, patting themselves on the back for these like funding increases that they bring back to their districts. When we know, like from our perspective and from the perspective of any school board member, the amount of money that Harrisburg is giving to school districts isn't even beginning to cover the cost, the increases in the school mandates that you were talking about, our charter school costs, our special education costs, pension costs. Those three costs together outstrip the increases in funding that we're getting from the state every single year. And so this is our opportunity to be able to actually shine a bright light on what is happening in our school buildings and draw a straight line from increased property taxes in local school districts and cuts in programs and services that really hurt kids. That line goes not to your school board, that line goes directly to the state legislator who has been elected to represent that district. That is your state senator, that is your state representative. So each and every one of us should know the first name of our state senator, the first name of our state representative. We should have their office numbers in our cell phones, so that when you are pumping gas and you have 5 minutes or you're dropping your kid off at school, you can call them and you can call their office in Harrisburg and say, hey, I'm just checking in, like, what are you gonna do to fix the school funding problem this year? And if we could get people doing that, it would take a minute. It would literally take a minute to call your state. What are you doing? School funding lawsuits happening right now. What's your solution to this problem? Like, that is what it's gonna take, because state lawmakers do what they think their constituents want. And if they start to see that their constituents are demanding a fix for the system, their behavior will change. And so we see in districts where their constituents, where people are rising up, they elect lawmakers who support public funding for public schools. And so I think that we need more and more legislators to start hearing from their constituents. And, you know, I will say some of these lawyers for the other side are I don't know. I couldn't go into a courtroom and make arguments that they are making, saying that, well, our schools, you know, they're not Taj Mahals, but our kids have desks and tables to write on, they have walls and they have plumbing. So we're good. You know, I mean, like they don't even really have plumbing if you're talking about 125 students sharing a single toilet. I'm just saying, you know what I mean? So we really need people to get engaged on this, and fundourschoolspa.org is the place to go.
I was going to note that sometimes the individual legislators would be willing to work, because I know a couple from here who would be willing to work on it, but the legislative leadership really controls what happens. When you go and swear in on the first day of your term, you're swearing in on rules of the House or rules of the Senate that allow the leadership total control. So how much of this is just a partisan failure and how much is it on the individual legislators?
I think there's a lot of partisanship, but I also think that we as advocates have not done the best job at making sure that people understand that the funding problems in our local school districts actually lie with our state lawmakers in Harrisburg. And I think that if rank and file Republicans and Democrats start hearing from a lot of constituents that they are very, very unhappy that their property taxes are going up and they're blaming their state lawmakers, I think that we could see lawmakers changing their behavior. But I think it's going to take a lot more people being willing to be more engaged, because they vote the way they think their constituents want them to vote. And you know what I mean? And I understand that there's this hyper partisanship in Harrisburg right now, but education is one of those issues. Like, people love their public schools. Parents want their kids to go to schools where they have opportunities. There is not a parent that I know who would want to say, like, cut my kid's band, cut my kid's art programs, you know, put my kid in a class of 35 kids. The problem is they're blaming their school boards for doing these things. They're blaming their superintendents, when in fact the problem is their state lawmakers.
Mm-hmm. So we all need to be, every citizen needs to be, even a non-citizen has some say here, because that person is representing non-citizens as well as citizens. And those legislators are representing school children. So we need maybe a school children's brigade of callers to say, we need more state funds so my school can work.
And in terms of timing, I would say that while we are very focused on the litigation and the trial right now, and we believe we'll be successful, it's important to also note that the legislature does not have to wait for a court order. And in fact, they could act now. They could act in this budget cycle. So the beginning of February, the governor will give his budget address, and he will make his proposal for allocations for basic education funding and special education funding and early childhood education funding. And then he will introduce that, and the legislature will spend the spring debating it and ultimately pass a budget by the end of June. And so the legislature does not have to wait for a court order. And in fact, they could this June adequately and equitably fund our schools.
If they could all get together and talk to each other. Go ahead.
Well, and things are a little different because in previous years, we've had these big budget deficits, but we have both $7 billion in unspent COVID relief federal funding that is one-time funding, but we're also seeing tax revenues coming in at much higher rates than anybody had expected. So we have recurring funding coming in through a budget surplus on the state level. And so there is money in Harrisburg to fund schools if lawmakers want to do that. They're sitting on a giant mountain of cash right now that should be taken, and instead of having them hoard it in that building in Harrisburg, they should be using these tax dollars, and they should be using them to solve the problems that our kids in our schools are experiencing right now. But
are they actually sitting on something close to $4.6 billion?
They're sitting on way more than that right now, and some of it's not recurring. So you don't want to take the one-time
whole thing,
money
right,
and put it in and say, like, we're gonna, because next year the money won't be there. But we are seeing increased state revenues coming in, and tax revenues are coming in at a higher rate, you know what I mean, than expected. And so we have a state budget surplus. Some of that money could just be used to increase our basic education funding and our special education funding. But they're not. They're hoarding it for some, whatever reason, because they want to create this narrative that there is austerity. The money isn't there. We can't do this, and that's just wrong. Like, that's just absolutely not true. There's a lot of money that they could be putting in schools right now.
And I had been thinking one thing, and I want to check whether my thought process is accurate, that the school funding formula that has been used had a hold harmless clause, and that whatever money you were getting, you would continue to get that much, even if you lost students, which means when students moved from one school to another, the old school kept the money, but the new school didn't necessarily get more. And a few years ago, they added another piece of funding onto that doesn't have that hold harmless. But is that hold harmless thing still in place? Is that still setting the basis of the funding at an unequal level?
So Schools are so inadequately funded and the pie is so small that simply redistributing the hold harmless money to follow the new kids would not solve a problem. It would simply take a whole lot of money away from one group of students and give it to another group of students. And a lot of students who would lose money are actually poor students, and many of those students are students of color. So it is not okay that there are students who have been so deeply, deeply shortchanged because of hold harmless, but it is simply redistributing that money doesn't solve a problem. What we need to do is we need to grow the pie, and then the new money that goes out needs to really be concentrated very, very heavily in the districts that have been the furthest shortchanged to make up for the inequities as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think
So-
it's really important. Education shouldn't be this zero-sum game where all the districts are left to fight over a pot of money that is just not large enough. And so that's why it's really important when we talk about the relief that is needed here. It is both, the amount for sure. The pie, as Susan said, is just too small. And then the pie needs to be distributed in an equitable way, but not in a way that's taking funding away from others.
So we need to balance out, but we don't need that hold harmless. If the pie is big enough, then that doesn't make any difference. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah,
So we
if the
just
pie
need-
were actually big enough, that is true.
Okay. And does that need the 4.6 billion a year to make that pie adequate? Or
In additional funding, so 4.6 billion in addition to the funding that districts already have in new money, yeah.
Mhm.
And Deborah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think too that the that 4.6 in some ways doesn't even capture it all because it doesn't take into account the increasing special education costs and all of that. So, that's a number that gets thrown about, but I don't think we can even say like, oh, well, if you just did that, which that would take care of all of it. Because
Right.
it doesn't include
Infrastructure, there are other costs that the district need to pay for that they do not have adequate funding for.
So even if the legislature increases the pie, we will still have some reliance on property tax, and there will still be districts that are much richer than other districts, based on that you're not going to raise a lot of tax money where you used to have anthracite coal mines and nobody's mining anthracite coal. But at least in the poorer districts, they will be able to do somewhat of a better job with education.
Bringing up, so that all of our students can be college and career ready. And the reality is that because we are so overly reliant on the local share, there are districts that simply cannot provide to their students what they need to be providing. And so this isn't about saying, this really isn't about not allowing a local district to raise taxes or not. This is about holding the state accountable for the state to do its job in adequately funding public education.
So the state funding should meet the state mandates for what is required to teach, basically. I'm going to speak for a minute as an older person. I collect Social Security, and my Social Security payments are totally dependent on people who are 2 generations younger than me, and that they're working and they're paying into their share on Social Security. And when I think of this shortchanging of these kids, we're really shortchanging the people who are 2 generations older, because when those kids grow up, they won't have those college salaries. They won't have that because they didn't have the foundation as youth. And there won't be the supports for the elderly in our country that we've had before because we're leaving too many children behind. Is that how you would see it? That this is something we're doing not just for children, but also for the grown-ups who need children's care?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole economic future of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania rests on whether or not we are educating our young people to be college and career ready. And so if we're graduating kids who are not going to be able to be successful in college and who are not going to be able to go into careers where they're going to both be like satisfied themselves, but also be able to be the workforce that is needed by our employers, employers are going to leave. And we're going to be in a very bad downward spiral. And I would say we don't have a lot of time to fix this because this has been going on for a long time. This predated the filing of the lawsuit. And we're starting to see like a generation of kids who are graduating, who have never been in a school that has had anything close to the resources that they have needed. And in some districts, it's been generations of kids. So we can't squander their talents and their potential. We really need to like develop it in all of our kids.
It's important to all of us, even those of us who live in better districts, that we have that workforce for the future. I would like to thank my guests. You have added so much information to our local knowledge. We thank you, Susan Spica, who's with Education Voters, and she's really made a good appeal for what we can do, getting the representative's number on our cell phone, calling them and saying it's time you did something about school funding, and we know how to use the phone, we can do that. And Deborah Clare and Mimi McKenzie, who are working the law firms that are bringing these suits to the public. And I know we will be hearing more, and I hope many of our viewers will take a few minutes and watch some of the trial testimony, because that's fascinating. I can't wait to see what the defendants show in their testimony, how they're going to make a case that everything is fine. It just seems a difficult thing to do. And before I say good night for everyone, I wanted to know that there's another lawsuit to be watching in the state legislature. They wanted to do an audit of election rolls, and they wanted all of our personal information, our driver's license numbers, the Social Security last 4 digits, and all that. And the League of Women Voters joined with a group bringing a lawsuit against that. And that lawsuit is starting tomorrow. So that's another lawsuit to spend attention to. I know amongst the people my age, there's a tremendous concern about identity theft if those numbers are out. So thank you, Mimi, Deborah, and Susan. And for the League of Women Voters, I'm Judith Cranis. Good day.